The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Election Aftermath, What is Next for Consultation? Today's panellists are Rhion Jones, TCI Programme Director, and Elizabeth Gammell, TCI Director of Standard. They will run through their analysis of the Conservative Party Manifesto, highlighting points for public engagement. You can submit questions during the session and we will try to answer as many as possible. I will now hand you over to Elizabeth.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I can't believe that it's actually 2 weeks ago that we were speculating. And like the rest of the world, we got it wrong. But in a sense, as so many other people got it wrong, we're not feeling too bad. Except that maybe, Rhion, we thought our political antennae might have been a little bit more in tune.
That's right, because we entitled the webinar weeks ago that the effect of coalitions would have on consultations would be such and such. We were wrong in doing that.
Never mind, 2 weeks is a long time. So today we are going to cover 3 things. And we hope that this will be sort of an opportunity for us all to reflect on how this is going to go. But we wanted to look at some reflections on that polling failure. Why didn't it work? What went wrong? And then, in some detail, have a look at the Conservative Manifesto, because it was absolutely full of all kinds of things that we'll share with you in a minute. But which of these are the ones that are going to most likely end up with a consultation? And therefore, if they are going to end in a consultation, we've sort of done a bit of crystal ball gazing and had a look to see which we think are the 5 most likely. Now, it's again very early days and there's a lot going to happen, but we hope that this is a good opportunity for you to start thinking about where we might be focusing in the next few months. So, Rhion, the polling.
The polling indeed. Those of us who are involved in public engagement almost certainly realise that there's a very specialist area called opinion polling, and it's not our field. So you may, however, have been reading, as I did, all the articles about, was it shy Tories, was it lazy Labour, was it the Lib Dem collapse, or indeed was there a late surge? Now, of all those, and of course the inquiry will probably tell us to some extent what went wrong, the most interesting dialogue in the last few days for me was when the internal posters for both the Conservative Party and for the Labour Party came out of the woodwork and said, we were getting a different result. And the reason they were getting a different result, so it is alleged, is that they use a different methodology. Now, because this may have a bearing upon the way we do consultations, I've asked Elizabeth to dig out what some of these internal posters said.
Well, here's a very interesting quote from James Morris of Greenberg, Quinlan, Rosner Research. And what his sort of thoughts were are the main difference between our polls and the newspaper polls is that we don't ask the voting intention first. We first ask respondents to think about the country, the economy, their top issues, the parties and the leaders. We think it gets them closer to their ballot box mindset. And this design delivers a much lower don't know number, generally half the level found in the public polls. Of course, that requires many more questions and so is more expensive to implement, especially for a phone pollster where every minute costs money.
Now, why this is important to us in the consultation field is that there has been a debate for a long, long time as to whether you bias the answers by asking people a lot of contextual questions before you get to the nub of the issue. I remember, Elizabeth, not so long ago, we were looking at a very contentious consultation on wind farms.
Indeed, yes.
And I think the point was that the consultor had asked all kinds of questions about what are your attitudes to renewable energy. In fact, what are your attitudes to saving the planet? Now, the argument of Mr. Morris and the others are, if you ask people to think of the country and think of the policies, they get an answer which is more like the ballot box, actually, than the traditional UK method, because that's an American
yes.
Style of doing these things. The UK method was to go straight in and say, well, who are you going to vote for? So the question we want to ask ourselves is, to what extent should we be looking at asking contextual questions of consultees rather more than we do now? And does it give you a more realistic answer, or does it give you a biased answer? You have to bear in mind that Peter Kellner, an old friend of mine who runs YouGov, Peter very robustly defended their methodology, and his argument goes like this. If our methodology is wrong, how do you explain the fact that in 80% of elections, they've actually got the result right? Because if they changed, presumably it might not be right. So I think there are a number of lessons going to come out of the investigations, and I think those of us working in consultation really ought to pay particular attention to whether preliminary context-setting questions make a difference.
No, I think that's fascinating, and certainly something that we'll be moving on to. So, the actual manifesto itself. It's a long document and huge amounts of detail in it, but what's going to be there for consultation?
Well, I wonder whether we in the Consultation Institute are as guilty as everybody else has been in assuming that it wasn't the manifestos that mattered this year, but rather more the coalition agreement that might have emerged after it. Have you got somewhere, Elizabeth, that quote we found in a planning blog? Somebody had written recently, well, is the other proposals on planning going to be that which the government expected to have to do?
Oh yes, this is George Wilson of Pinsent Masons saying, the Conservative Party's manifesto was drafted in the context of both a likely hung parliament and a potential Conservative minority government, with resulting compromises. However, the surprise result may mean the new majority government has different priorities, and we see if and how the government policies shift over the next parliament.
The first thing to say is there anything in the Conservative Manifesto that gives a clue as to what the attitude of the new regime will be to public engagement and consultation as a whole? And I have to tell you, the answer to that is almost a resounding no. Unlike the Lib Dems, and unlike parts of the Labour manifesto, there doesn't seem to be any greater commitment to public engagement. So we put that on the table straight away. Remember that a few weeks ago we published the Better Engagement Agenda.
Absolutely, and we were hoping for a new set of standards and indeed an ombudsman for consultation.
Well, I'm not sure we'll achieve either of those two, if only because the key minister is Oliver Letwin, who has effectively retained, in fact, got a promotion into the cabinet. Now, I think we ought to have a go at it, because the case for having a better set of standards than the existing principles is still a sound one, and the case for having an ombudsman has always been a good one. So I don't think we can expect anything of that. There are very, very strong assertions in favour of things like neighbourhood planning. Neighbourhood planning, one has to say, is one of the big successes of the previous administration. There are 1,400 communities in this country where they're trying to do neighbourhood planning, and that is redolent with community engagement.
Absolutely, and we were always rather disappointed that the neighbourhood planning didn't get more sort of traction earlier on, but I'm glad to see it sort of happening now, and I think sort of work that we did last time round will definitely come back again and be useful, as communities really do need to sort of get their act together on engaging.
Yes, the village I live in, Nickwell Green, has got an annual May Day fete, and I was really interested to see that there was a local neighbourhood plan tent there this year, and it is a tremendous source of on-the-ground engagement. And of course runs counter to a lot of the traditional ways in which planning is going to be done. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention to colleagues is that the Conservative Manifesto also reintroduces, wait for it, the big society. Not in quite the all-embracing way that it was sold to us 5 years ago, but they are particularly keen on further developing the National Citizen Service. I think it's very strong volunteering. I think they've dropped quite a lot of the other stuff. So that's another public engagement related
Absolutely.
area. Now, much of the manifesto is full of what I would call general economic policy. So we are not taking a great deal of heed of things like commitments to reducing the deficit or changing the balance of welfare spending and so forth. We're taking those as being very obvious commitments made in the glare of publicity. What we're going to focus on now for the next few minutes is, okay, if you take the manifesto commitments, all the other manifesto commitments, you know, when and where are we going to have public consultations? So if one asks the question, which of the various elements of a manifesto will require consultation? It's a rather complicated answer, isn't it?
Incredibly, yes.
There are three imperatives, I guess. One is when it is a political imperative. In other words, you're not going to get this particular commitment through unless you've widened the debate and got a degree, at least, of public dialogue going. I suppose there are quite a lot of things like maybe the Bill of Rights taking over from the Human Rights Act, where whatever the government's arithmetic is in the House of Commons, truth is they're not going to get it through the House of Lords. People have rather forgotten that they made 120 Lib Dem peers in the last 5 years, and they, of course, were government supporters, and no longer will they be so. So where you really face a tough political battle to get it through, then I guess that's one reason why you consult. So we would call that a political imperative. Another one, effectively, would be a stakeholder imperative. Are there proposals here where if you can't get agreement on consensus with a particular stakeholder, you can forget it? I'm just looking somewhere in the back of my mind, there's a commitment in this manifesto to approve Lord Ashcroft's proposals. Remember, he did a study on how we should deal with veterans. Now, I would imagine unless they get the British Legion and the other stakeholder organisations, SAFA and all the others on side, they won't get that through. So, you know, that's a stakeholder-led one.
Indeed, yes.
And finally, of course, we've got the legal requirement. When might it be a legal requirement to consult? And those of you who recall 2 weeks ago, we were talking about how Michael Gove found himself unexpectedly losing a judicial review after the last general election because he hadn't anticipated that there was a legitimate expectation on behalf of local authorities that they be consulted over building schools for future. Will there be many of those this time round?
I don't know, but I think the last 5 years and the number of judicial reviews that have happened, I think people are much more alert to the prospects of the legitimate expectation aspect of things. So if they haven't learned anything from building schools for the future, that'll be a pity.
So we now resolve this dilemma, in a sense, how much consultation might there be, into looking with some precision at the language of a manifesto. This is unbelievably complicated. We have actually located about 25 different formulations somebody will increase the support for, or provide significant new support for. They will build something, they will reform something, they will introduce something, they will create something into it. And what we try to do, Elizabeth, isn't it, is categorize it into sort of 6 different categories?
Yes, as you hopefully can see on your screen here, aspiration, change, support, legislation, consultations and reviews, which is obviously where we're extremely interested, and commitments. But actually all of this could end up with some form of consultation or certainly engagement, and probably will be much better done if it does.
But if it comes to a court deciding have you created an expectation, it might simply boil down to what degree of enthusiasm lies behind the words they've used in the manifesto, mightn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we've pulled this apart a little bit, and on the aspiration, the wording is things like, we have an ambition that, we will negotiate, and beside them are things like, you know, ultra-fast broadband and benefits, entitlements, and that sort of thing.
So I see on that one, Elizabeth, they want to increase the percentage of public appointments going to women.
I'm greatly in favour of that.
Yeah, but we want to increase isn't quite the kind of commitment that is what you could call it sort of solid, rock solid, we will do it, isn't it?
Well, I'd like to say in another 5 years we'll look back at that one and see if they managed it.
Under the category of change that the government wants to bring about, we will reform. What do they want to reform? The student visa program, or the way we rehabilitate prisoners. We will introduce a number of things they want to introduce. We all know about English votes for English laws. We probably have come across the random testing of drug use in jails. There's lots of things where they say we want to change it. Would that amount to a commitment of the kind that would require a consultation? What's the next one you've got?
Oh, we've got support. We will support, we will encourage. And these are there's one here that I think is definitely going to be high profile: safe development of shale gas and communities benefit package. And also locally led garden cities.
But they've also got a great exhibition in the north. They've got freezing rail fares. So when they say they want to support something, do you think that's the same as a commitment of we will do?
Well, it's possibly not as strong, but you know, support can be very, very definite.
I suppose it's more definite when they say they're going to pass legislation.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that is startling in this particular manifesto is how few commitments they've made to legislating.
Indeed.
I suppose the most obvious one is the EU in-out referendum. That would need a piece of legislation, isn't it?
I suppose that's such a big and obvious one that they are sort of. But there's an interesting one here about public sector frontline staff to have fluent English.
Give us a few problems in part of Wales, but there we are.
Oh dear.
So legislation, the high-profile debate will be that they're going to have, or they're going to give the opportunity to have a vote in Parliament on repealing the hunting bill.
Indeed.
That will activate a lot of people, I would have thought. Okay, then we go to consultations and reviews. Do you know, it's remarkable, the Lib Dem manifesto had a dozen or more specific commitments to consult. This one doesn't, but it does have a rather important one on business rates. They even want to consult on business rate relief for local newspapers. And of course, a number of reviews. There will, of course, I hope you all realize, be a defense review. In fact, they're calling it a national security and strategic defense review as well as I think there will be quite a lot of consultation implicit in a further review of legal aid. I can see the legal profession getting very excited about that.
I'm sure they will. So
then we have a wide variety of commitments. Well, these commitments, they're miscellaneous commitments. We will take forward a right to build, because you realize this manifesto is rather different from the other parties because it says for the last 5 years we've been doing X. And it's a continuity commitment, and we will continue to do something. But they certainly have some interesting commitments.
We will guarantee same-day GP appointments for those over 75 years old, which, given the pressure on our GP services...
Well, hasn't David Cameron today been
I heard that, yes.
going into the whole 7-day by 24-hour National Health Service?
Absolutely.
I mean, I think that one, the guarantee on same-day appointments will almost certainly give them enormous problems in terms of the NHS's own requirements to consult. So, I mean, I think what you can see from all of this is that the language varies. It's one thing to say, we will build something, we will create something. It's another thing to say, and we will in general support something. I noticed, Elizabeth, I don't know if you did, that we will provide significant new support for mental health. If you remember, before Norman Lamb lost his ministerial position, he was talking a lot about that, but what does that mean? What does that mean in money? What does that mean in terms of services and so forth? So we now need to move ahead, I think, to choose which are the 5 most likely ones to generate a degree of consultation. You already mentioned 1 or 2 of them, haven't you?
Well, yes. I mean, this is entirely us going through using what we think, is our own political sort of acumen. But here, I hope you can see the 5 we've identified, and shale gas is already there. And Rhion's mentioned the business rates one, but I think very contentious the issue of reducing benefits for people who are refusing treatment for things like if they have obesity and alcohol and drug addictions.
That's a really interesting one because, of course, it cuts so much across the DWP agenda and the NHS agenda. And you're going to have a lot of human rights type issues. Is it right to withdraw treatment? And that's what they're talking about, withdrawing treatment, are they?
No.
They're saying if you refuse treatment,
you will have your benefits reduced.
You will have your benefits reduced. That is going to be an enormous... It's one of these totemic issues, isn't it, for the DWP, because they're trying to change behaviour. They're trying, in fact, to affect the prevalence of particularly obesity. I think alcohol and drug addiction is very different, isn't it?
Yes.
I think obesity is something that affects so many people in society now.
There's the connection with diabetes and
absolutely,
so which all kind of plays a part, and is putting a huge strain on the NHS.
So the question is, if that was the policy, if you were the minister today, Elizabeth, would you be contemplating a nationwide consultation on the policy, or would you be encouraging each and every part of the NHS, first of all, to consult on the kind of treatments that were mandatory?
I mean, I think this is one that people will have very strong views on. I think there will obviously be a population of people who, actually are not affected by this, but feel that their hard-earned taxpayers' money is going into supporting people, and therefore, in a time when we really can't have sort of everybody being supported with everything, as nice as that might be, when money's tight and things have to be allocated, I think that's going to be one which I think a lot of people will have a very strong view on. But I think the important thing will be to do that consultation so that they really do get the views they need.
And it will almost certainly involve a lot of stakeholder organisations, a lot of national bodies and so forth. Let's move on to the next one, because they call it shale gas development. The word that they're not using is fracking.
It's fracking.
There are whole areas of renewable technology where the Conservative Party has been facing a slightly different direction from their previous Lib Dem partners. I mean, the one that's most visible to us just down south from here in Biggleswade, the biggest change in the landscape last few years has been...
we've got an amazing wind farm.
Farm.
If you come up to visit us in the Institute and look as you approach Biggleswade, you'll see the 9 turbines of the Langford wind farm, which were incredibly contentious locally, and all kinds of protests and complaints and letters in the Biggleswade Chronicle, and a lot of planning interaction over that one.
Yeah, the manifesto is actually a little bit less anti-wind farms than I expected it to be, but we all know that the view of the new Conservative administration is that only on rare occasions should you build these things onshore, but they're encouraging them offshore. Now, I think shale gas is an entirely different one. This is my bet for being the most contentious area for planning disputes and for communities to get upset. I think High Speed 2 probably was the high point of dissent in the last 5 years. But fracking could be a big one. And of course, the government's policy has been, we want this to happen. I'm not sure it's a green light. I think, so I can have my joke, the new Minister of Energy is called Amber Rudd. So if they haven't got a green light for fracking, I think one could say they've got an amber light for fracking. And the trouble with that, of course, is that if you're an incumbent government, is that there are many occasions in the planning cycle where people who dislike a particular development can make their views known.
Oh, indeed.
And I think this one will be a thorn in their flesh. As, of course, may also be the boundary reforms that have been long promised and which were thwarted by...
I was going to say, we didn't have it last time because the Liberal Democrats...
they wouldn't have it.
They wouldn't have it.
Now we're talking about constituency boundaries, but that means in effect that if this goes through, there will be a consultation of some considerable controversy affecting a lot of parts of the country.
I mean, how many MPs are they thinking of going down to?
They're thinking of losing 50. I mean, personally, I would reduce them by half, but that's not the consultation.
That's for another webinar.
But if they're going to get rid of 50, it's by equalising the population. Now, that's always been a very difficult issue. When I stood for Parliament in Wales, I was in a constituency with only 28,000 people and rather more sheep. I let everybody else make the jokes on that. So equalising those brings to bear a lot of issues, and I think the consultations will in fact be very extensive, and of course they will be local. Talking about local, you also have garden cities. I think perhaps the current government has forgotten quite the difficulties that Labour got into around about 2008 when they asked parts of the south of England to volunteer to set aside land for garden cities, and almost the entire south of England decided that they wanted to object to anything happening close to them.
We've had a question from Chris Witherington, and he asks us, what do you think will be the balance between the drive towards localism in planning and the need for centralised infrastructure priorities?
I think it's huge. I think the balance, I think the issue is huge. I think the balance is particularly going to be difficult in the north of England, because George Osborne is clearly making it his life's work now to create a northern powerhouse. Maybe he's looking for a northern power base. But in doing that, you have to take the strategic issues, and you cannot decide in Manchester whether you happen to want the link between Manchester and Leeds. It has to be a kind of joint agreement. That's why dismantling the regional planning bodies was inevitably going to mean taking some of those decisions, not pushing them downwards, but actually taking them up to the Department of Transport in this case.
Well, exactly. I mean, we've got debates like High Speed 3 and, of course, nuclear power on the agenda.
I suppose it is right to comment that by removing Eric Pickles from DCLG and putting Greg Clark into it, Greg Clark, to his credit, was a very firm enthusiast for localism, and I think was one of the architects of the Localism Act when he was a junior minister. So that's going to be one to watch. I'm not sure that I can answer Chris Witherington's point directly, other than to say that balance is difficult for any government to strike. I mean, the infrastructure plan, as John Pritchard of Copper was telling me only recently, the infrastructure plan, in fact, is very ambitious. There's £100 billion worth of projects in the mind of this government, and it will need to spend a lot of it on energy, but they're also promising 15 billion, I think the figure is, on roads. So, I mean, although we've identified these 5, I guess your instinct and mine, Elizabeth, is that maybe it's not national policy consultations going to be the flashpoints, it's more going to be the local community ones where they feel under threat of some sort or another.
Well, indeed, and the work that we've been doing, especially over the last 5 years, in health as well as in local authority work, and indeed with the police and fire and rescue services, all shows how really good local engagement actually helps progress happen, and consultations do actually aid people to make their views felt. So I hope we can continue to do that.
I see we've had a question in on the NHS, and to what extent will the consultations that are almost certainly happening in the next 6 months on inherited changes to hospital services, the reconfigurations, whether these will go ahead or will there be something different? I mean, I guess, Elizabeth, the evidence from the last 2 weeks into our office is that they're, in fact, going to proceed very quickly indeed.
Yes, I mean, we were being given a just wait till the election and then we're going to see what happens. Well, we've been taken slightly by surprise as to how quickly people now want to go ahead with it.
One of our clients the other day rang up and said there are these 2 CCGs, that's clinical commissioning groups, these 2 CCGs, that have got these half-baked, and I shouldn't say this, they've got these proposals which maybe haven't been totally finalised. They've got these proposals, and now the election is over, they can't see why they can't go ahead and implement them. And I think my client was basically saying the CCG is only just realising that it may have quite a hurdle to cross by way of consultation first. So that accelerated implementation, now they have the confidence of a business-as-usual government, especially with Jeremy Hunt having retained his role in Department of Health, is probably going to make us very busy anyway.
Well, indeed. So I think 2 weeks later, here we are, sort of now speculating on what a government with a majority, albeit a slim one, is going to look like. We'll certainly be continuing to do webinars on these subjects, and it's great to know that we have an audience out there who want to engage on the debate with us. So thank you very much for listening to us today, and I hope that your consultations are progressing very smoothly.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Elizabeth and Rhion. Today's webinar is now ending. We appreciate if you could spend just a couple of minutes of your time to send us some feedback on today's webinar, but also any thoughts and ideas you may have for future members' webinars. We do hope that you will join us again very soon. Have a great week. Thank you.